Anyways, for this segment today, I want to discuss the Russian oligarchs and why they are so important and focused on, and why a lot of the sanctions are trying to force them to make changes, put pressure on them. You know, in the news, we've seen yachts get seized, football club owners like Chelsea sell off their teams, and some of the harshest sanctions in history being put currently on the Russian people and the Russian oligarchs from all around the world. And I was talking to a friend a few nights ago who was, talking about his experience living in London. And it's crazy to hear about his descriptions of these wealthy Russian families just owning all the real estate in these high rent areas. It's like, oh, the top of that building, they have a pool, giant penthouse. It's all Russian money. And I think that's an interesting point to be made on all of this, is that there's a lot of just uber wealthy Russian oligarch money that is around the world. It's like they've kind of escaped the Russian system because of power and wealth. And I think that's part of the reason why they're focusing on targeting these oligarchs. And so let's start breaking it down. So the Wall Street Journal can help us at least get into the terminology here. They have an article from today that says, in quotes here, the term oligarch comes from political science. An oligarchy describes a power system led by a small group of people. In recent years, the word oligarch has taken on a more specific meaning when it relates to Russia, referring to the group of Russian business people and officials who gained wealth and power in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, end quotes. And I think that's a good point because, oligopolies have existed throughout history, right? Powerful few running a country of many. But in this case, it's kind of what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union and how these collectivist industries tried to sell them off, and certain people were able to get access to that. And this Wall Street Journal article also helps us clarify that this is not the first time that these oligarchs have been sanctioned. Just starting off, just in a general sense, the U.S. has sanctioned many of these individuals in years past, including after the 2014 invasion and attempted annexation of Crimea. And back in 2014, the US, the EU, the UK, for example, did intensify restrictions and added names to their list of sanctions. So basically, the majority of these oligarchs have been targeted, or at least been part of the conversation. And there's a reason for it. They are either part of Putin's inner circle or actually gained their wealth even before Putin during the privatization in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union had collapsed and was already moving on to kind of that next weird kind of intermediary between collectivist communism, socialism, whatever you want to call it, and a capitalist society. And I would argue, just putting it off the bat, is I don't think Russia's ever actually crossed the Rubicon into being an open society. They've always kind of bounced on that line. But I do think that this Wall Street Journal article, before I move on, I think this article has a funny point where it says that not all these oligarchs have mega yachts, but most do. And, with the inequality in Russia and the fact that there's not a lot of mobilization amongst the working people in Russia, to see oligarchs that don't even live in Russia, that are still flourishing off the system with yachts in the Mediterranean, owning football clubs, the basketball teams, it's just kind of insane, I guess. And where I want to more focus, though, is that late 80s, early 90s period, to really understand why and who these people are and why they're able to get so wealthy after literally the entire dominancy of the Soviet Union was about limiting private business. So I read some very interesting excerpts from a book from 24 called The Oligarchs, Wealth and Power in Russia. And the book is by David Hoffman. It's a really fascinating read that I really do believe helps us understand what happened. There's a lot of significant points, and he does a great job of outlining it. But Hoffman points out that it is really important to know that when we talk about these oligarchs, we are not talking about people who simply just stole money at the end of the Soviet Empire, because lots of people stole. What Hoffman talks about, when the Soviet Union collapsed, stealing was not a major accomplishment. but it's more that there were people that actually found entire national resources of the country and wanted to control those. For example, steel, oil, energy, things like that. That's what really the idea of an oligarch is. Someone who controls the almost entire sector of something. And Hoffman notes that when let me see here, getting the entire natural resources of a country under your control and getting the president of the country under your control is what it takes to be an oligarch. And to set the stage, private entrepreneurship was criminal in the Soviet Union. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, the Soviet economy was state-owned, very collectivist, and that was the majority of their running up to the 90s. But by the 1980s, this system was seeing serious issues internally and externally, and the economic situation just wasn't sustainable. Let's remember that this is when Gorbachev started some of these reforms to open up the economy, open up the media, and there was already a clear acknowledgement inside of Soviet leadership. And Gorbachev, I actually give him a lot of credit for understanding this because he was more willing to work with the West because I think he just saw this wasn't sustainable. But on a side note, I would also imagine that part of the reason that the economy was struggling so significantly was because of the invasion of Afghanistan, right? When the Soviets invaded, it just completely destroyed the Russian economy. It was almost a 10-year invasion, occupation that obviously led to the U.S. arming the Mujahideen, etc. And they put a lot of money and resources into this, and that's probably one of the big indicators of why the Soviet Empire started to see a lot of issues, because they were so focused on the military spending and there wasn't a lot else happening. And this should be a lesson for Putin today. But anyways, so in the 1980s, the economy could just, by the end, not deliver services, right? The majority, like I said, was on their military spending. And that was becoming a very clear problem. So in a last-ditch effort, Hoffman writes in this book that several members of the Politburo pushed through a resolution that would lead the fight against what they called unearned incomes. And I'm not an expert on this at all, but I'm just trying to understand it to get the information to you guys. So from what I've gathered, they opened up a little bit. They understood that just a closed collectivist society was not going to work. They obviously, during this late 80s period, they did not let cooperatives run mills or take over oil refineries, for example, or anything like at that actual level. But they did allow people that were selling goods such as bread or milk start running small businesses, which was actually very weird for the Soviet Union to actually let individuals make money off of selling a service. Now, to us as Americans, that just sounds insane. Like, that's the whole idea of kind of the American capitalist system. But to them, that was new. But I think that's an important period, is when they started looking at these unearned incomes and started recognizing that we should start letting people at least have some freedom in selling things. And so that was when they started to allow a small free market ideal to grow. So during this time, there was a guy named Mikhail Khodorkovsky who really started experimenting with the loopholes that were possible when the economy was starting to open up. And under this unearned income issue, he really got ahead. And just to read you the Wikipedia summary of this guy, so Khodorkovsky is now exiled. He's an exiled Russian businessman, philanthropist, and former oligarch, now residing in London. Funny. And in 2003, Khodorkovsky was believed to be the wealthiest man in Russia, with a fortune estimated to be about 15 billion, but it was probably more, honestly. And he was at the time ranked the 16th richest person on Forbes' list of billionaires. And so anyways, during this late 80s period where the Russian economy was kind of playing with some free market ideals, he opened up a small coffee shop in the lobby of a chemical institution in Moscow, and it failed. It completely failed. And it was a disaster, as Hoffman calls it in his book. But Khodorkovsky did not stop, from what I've gathered. Apparently he was very scheming, diabolical, intelligent, but quiet, and he listened, and he was not really very intimidating, so a lot of people trusted him. And so I want to read this little section from Hoffman's book here. it's kind of a good analysis of how Khodorkovsky did this. So it says here in quotes, and bear with me, it's kind of long. So Khodorkovsky set out to find a way to take a large amount of non-cash state subsidies which sat in various factories, oftentimes unused. These institutes and factories needed real cash, real rubles, which existed side by side as another kind of money. Real rubles were scarce and usually only for paying wages. He figured out how, with the permission of the party, to take the non-cash, worthless accounting subsidies that institutes and industry received from the Gosplan Agency, which was the central planning agency, and he transformed them into real cash, which he then could kick back to the directors, put in his own bank account, and then use for his own purposes, end quotes. And Hoffman writes later, in quotes here, he used a tiny loophole to take the workers in any institution, call them your labor collective temporarily, and pay them with this special money. He took people in their own factory, gave them a symbolic designation, and used that loophole to then say, I have to pay them all in cash. Then he took the subsidies, turned it into cash into his own bank, or into the state bank account, and then had a lot of cash left over for himself, for the director, for the government, and other purposes. And honestly, it's pretty fascinating to me, and all else being equal, it's kind of genius. And I'm being sort of sarcastic with that because I think it's awful for the people, but it's kind of genius to just completely use the system in such a favor that you can actually use the state subsidized programs to do this. And I think it shows the ingenuity of people and the greed of people that apparently communism was supposed to alleviate, to get rid of, right? I thought that was the whole idea of the Leninist leading to Stalinist ideology, was this would get rid of these type of problems. But again, we saw massive greed here, so I would probably just argue that human beings are corrupt and flawed. But anyways, now Khodorkovsky was not this only guy who did this, right? So I'm just painting you an example of him because I think he's the most poignant example of it. But he was just one of the people who really did this well. And Hoffman in this book notes that many people were trying to do this. And by the early 90s, this age of money had exploded. And people like Khodorkovsky were everywhere doing this. So it went from Khodorkovsky and a few other young guys who could use the system to hundreds or even thousands of these type of people. And this is where it gets even worse. So Hoffman writes that the most critical point was the arrival of this voucher privatization. So basically what I've understood here is that Khodorkovsky accumulated as many of those vouchers as he could use. And Hoffman writes here in quotes, he in turn used them to buy interests in 29 different companies, oil, chemicals, and food processing, end quotes. And so during the Yeltsin era, which was, kind of early to mid 90s into the late 90s, there was this guy named Anatoly Chubais. And he is kind of credited for this Yeltsin era privatization that led to the growth of the oligarchs. And this voucher system, this voucher privatization system, was where the state left the ownership of certain assets contested. And this allowed for just these informal deals with former USSR officials as a means to acquire property. Right? It should also be noted that because these assets had been owned by the state for 50, 60 years generally, many who took advantage of these current prices bought some of these commodities for basically pennies on the dollar, because the old domestic prices for Russian commodities, such as, let's just say, natural gas and steel, were just not comparable to where the world market was at. So the complete calculation inside of the USSR, or the former Soviet USSR by that point, the price that they could buy these industries from the government for was just not where they were selling on a global market. And so Hoffman notes in this book that the assumption of Anatoly Chubais, who was kind of Yeltsin's architect of this, was, in quotes, if we give all the property away, ultimately the people who get it will either succeed or fail on their own wits and wisdom, end quotes. And now that's a very capitalist idea, but it's in a system with no rules of capitalism and no understanding of prices, market value, simple economics because it was built on a completely different collectivist society. Now, I did read last week when I started really thinking about covering this that in order to buy some companies and get significant shares of them during this voucher privatization system, this required a lot of money for down payment, right? And usually the only people that had this much money to do it were criminal lords, mob bosses, and nefarious organizations that had a lot of petty cash. So it's not crazy to say that a lot of the people that had the money to buy up certain sectors that were all of a sudden being privatized were mob-related organizations or at least criminal syndicates in that area. And it gets more interesting because by the mid-90s, the state still owned about 20%, according to Hoffman, in these crucial commodities like steel and oil. But people like we've talked about throughout this, like our good friend Kordovsky, for example, wanted control, right? They wanted to completely control these means of production from these ex-state-owned collectivist companies. And they found a convenient relationship with actually Boris Yeltsin himself. And so you could kind of call it a deal with the devil or just a deal of convenience. And this small group of people like Kordovsky helped get Boris Yeltsin reelected. And they kept like him protected and in power to keep off this perceived communist threat. In exchange, they got a new round of privatizations and a very small number, but a large amount of property. So you have like 100 oligarchs, for example, now all of a sudden having majority ownership of, say, like Russian steel, for example. Hoffman also notes that, in quotes here, the crown jewels were given out in 1995 and 1996, oil and minerals. And this is when Kordovsky got his Yukos oil company, which he had his eye on for several years, end quotes. And like I've already kind of alluded to, Yeltsin was in a place where he wanted to stop communism from returning. And there were candidates at the time who wanted to remove him from office and kind of return to that Soviet era. And he allied with these oligarchs and kind of let them run the table. And because he then made these powerful allies, he had to give them something in return, which were these previously state-owned industries. And I think it's a really interesting way to look at this, is that the Soviet Union was in a very strange political state. And Boris Yeltsin, I am not a fan of the guy. I don't know a significant amount about him, but from what I've read, he was not a good leader, but also trying to balance a very complicated political climate and a very complicated business climate. And these oligarchs, I think, took advantage of his political needs so that they could run the means of production in almost like every sector of previously Soviet-owned industries. I think probably the strengths of this Hoffman book, which there are a lot, is that he talks about how Yeltsin's decisions during this period had really dangerous and profound consequences. He talks about how Yeltsin basically decided with the liberal reformers to create maximum freedom first and rules later. And I've already kind of alluded to that, but I think that's the issue here, is they decided to just open up the economy and allow opportunistic people to buy into it and control means of production for certain industries, but there were no rules established. And that's a huge problem if you're, spending about 70 years of collectivist policies and overnight basically completely shifting them to a privatized capitalist system. And of course you're going to have dangerous opportunistics. And so Hoffman, in the second part of his book, talks about how this vacuum was created during this time, and in came chaotic forces of evil, in quotes, cheaters, charlatans, hooligans, criminal gangs, corrupt politicians, and oligarchs, end quotes. And that, I think, can help us understand what has occurred in Russia. The Soviet Union fell, but the country never really adjusted to an open society, and just ex-Soviet people with the money were able to buy out these new sectors of the economy. I think it's also important to put this into context because Putin, who is obviously on the minds of a lot of people these days, he played a very insignificant role in this 90s period, actually. So he missed out on this whole period in a lot of ways. He was in Germany for the majority of it back when he was still working for the KGB and the intelligence services. But later he was in St. Petersburg, and it seems like he just completely was doing a different thing at this time, so he never understood the chaos that was occurring during these 90s economic reforms. But of course, he eventually came to power, as I don't have to tell anyone. And from my understanding, part of it was that he got back into Russian politics, or not back into it, I guess, decided to get into Russian politics about the time that people were starting to ask questions about what was happening. And part of it was that he was this outsider who had Soviet connections. He'd worked for the Soviet intelligence. He'd been in this, he was part of the old regime. But he was this outsider who wanted to fix this issue and try to help Russia still, I guess, be strong. And obviously the rest is history, because at least from the numbers I've seen, and it's really hard to actually calculate those and really quantify the specifics, but it does seem like Putin is at least one of, if not the richest people in the world. And his rule has led to this new generation of oligarchs, which I'll talk about before we end this episode. So it's again interesting how it seems like Putin came in as kind of a disruptor who was kind of a nationalist, who did still like the idea of a strong Russia, but at the same time he also didn't agree with what was happening in the country. And this is where it gets interesting, because I was talking with a buddy, Cole, of mine a few nights ago, and we were talking about fascism versus communism. And I made the point that I think fascism in a lot of ways is communism with private industry. It's like you take the government control of something, but then incorporate the private sector. And it seems like that's what's actually kind of happened under Putin, is that it's almost like all of this has escalated where there are now nationalist oligarchs who are private actors, very privatized free market capitalists, but they still believe in the rule of law and this strong government influence over freedom of speech, over media. And I think that's what kind of fascism in a lot of ways is. It's nationalism with strong authoritarian tendencies with a private sector. And that seems to be where Russia's kind of in this gray area for. And I think it was that 90s transition where they just completely transferred all this wealth from the state to opportunists. And that's where I think it's created this strange society in Russia where the people are almost nihilistic towards everything, because what's the point to some of them at this point? Just ending this, let's go full circle back to the sanctions and why the sanctions are coming. Basically, these oligarchs or these elites are the last group that can really get hit hard by sanctions, right? The Atlantic has a great article from Saturday, so yesterday, that is called "The Russian Elite Can't Stand the Sanctions." And it goes over how some of these oligarchs are getting hit by the sanctions and even maybe breaking from Putin. And we have to remember that a lot of them were actually products of the policies of Yeltsin and Putin. But it's interesting to see that when their power is questioned, what may happen to them. So the Atlantic outlines a few of these oligarchs and how they're responding to the sanctions. So I'll just go through them really quick. So there's a billionaire industrialist, Oleg Deripaska, and Mikhail Friedman. Friedman is a founder of Russia's largest private bank, and both of them, for different reasons, have actually come out to urge Putin to end this war. And they were, I want to say about a week ago, they were some of the first big names. Deripaska and Friedman were the first big names to come out and say, this is not happening. We should not be doing this. What is the fucking point here? And I think this was the first break in ranks, I guess you could say, amongst Russia's elites. Deripaska is on the U.S. sanction list, so he's been focused on by the United States, and Friedman is on the EU's list. And I do think that some of these people, now that they're realizing that some of the games they've been playing for decades are catching up to them. There's also Roman Abramovich, who's probably the most well-known oligarch, at least to me. He's someone I can actually visualize when you say Abramovich. I can just go, yes, I know exactly who you're talking about. And he's a close associate of Putin. And, he's put his soccer club, Chelsea, he owns Chelsea, or owned, I guess, Chelsea. He put it up for sale and vowed to donate all the proceedings, in quotes, to all the victims of the war in Ukraine, end quotes. And that's something even more interesting because he's a product of Putin. But the external pressure of what's happening has forced him, to sell Chelsea, which is one of the greatest football clubs in the world. I hate them. I'm a Real Madrid fan. A la Madrid, by the way. But Chelsea's a very internationally recognized club. And the fact that he's been a face of it and has been forced to sell it and then also say we need to stop this, I think it's huge. And also, Abramovich also apparently over the weekend accepted the Ukrainian government's request for some mediation efforts and peace talks with the Russian government. I don't think he actually cares, to be honest. I really don't think he cares. But the fact that these external pressures are making his luxury lifestyle uncomfortable might be enough. There's also a guy, Oleg Tinkov, who apparently has a fucking huge yacht. He's probably the one that a lot of us have seen. But this yacht also has a mini fucking submarine attached to it. And he of all people, who is clearly doing great from this system, he even posted on Instagram yesterday, in quotes here, that innocent people are dying in Ukraine now and every day. This is unthinkable and unacceptable, end quotes. And now again, this is a rich guy living outside of the United States, outside of Russia, who is clearly flourishing off of Russia but is decoupled from Russia. And clearly he has interests that are huge, that are other than just, okay, Ukraine, it's a humanitarian problem. I don't think he's a good guy. Let's get that across our minds. He's not a good guy. But the fact that he is feeling the pressure to actually speak out against it, I think is somewhat of a glass half full moment. I just think all these examples do show that some of the most known and powerful oligarchs that have flourished off of this system are breaking from it. And if I was Putin, I would be, again, even more terrified because, his tables are getting longer as he isolates himself from everybody. And I guess if you're in Putin's shoes, you can understand why, because he feels like no one agrees with him. It's kind of nuts, honestly. I also will just wrap this up because I want to just talk a little more about this Atlantic article because it has some other good points after it outlines these different oligarchs and how they've basically been responding. And it talks about how Putin's credibility does rely on oligarchs like Abramovich. And the article says here in quotes, they provide invaluable public support for the regime, lead key companies and institutions, and distract from attention, end quotes. I think that's a good point because the credibility of someone like Putin, he does need people around him. As much as he seems isolated and radical, he needs people around him. I also saw that Alexei Navalny, who I actually have my own problems with, but he's been very good in the Russian context of speaking out against what's happening. And he's been arguing for years and years that Putin's continuing ability to exercise power does require the cooperation and support from others. And it's just interesting because he's put out a list of oligarchs that are completely linked with Putin, and I think it's important. I think he's doing a good service to the world. Now, he's also a right-wing nationalist because I think that's what Putin and Russia have created. And the Yeltsin era, the entire process has created this kind of nationalism, this kind of weird economic fascism. And, there's numerous studies over the last few decades about how people do, especially powerful people with status, do prefer power and recognition of their status over just material wealth. They want to be recognized and respected more than just their actual material wealth. Now, obviously, those two things come mutually exclusive in a lot of ways. But I think this may be the root of how some of these oligarchs are being slowed down around the world right now, is because they are losing that power and credibility while they still have the wealth. And I think for some of them, it's the followers on Twitter and Instagram. It's the respect and the world looking at them and the just semblance of power that they might have that might pertain to what they're doing. Now, I think that's where sanctions will work. Going back to what I talked to at the top of the show, how there's Russian oligarch families living around the world, flourishing on different structures that are more open. Putin has done campaigns of hate against gay people. His war in Chechnya, there's even been talks about what they've done with minority communities there. He's a dangerous guy. And I think we need to put pressure on that. But I do have issues at the same time with sanctions because I think because we are, like I said again at the top of the show, we are doing some of the most historically intense, or the most historically intense sanctions of all time. And they can be used as a propaganda tool for the Putin regime. Basically as the sanctions destroy the Russian economy and make it more difficult for the people, the Kremlin-sanctioned media can turn this messaging against the West, blaming the West for the suffering. They can say, see, you have no bread, prices are high, society's breaking down. It's because of what the West did. And as times get more difficult, it's easier for people to start pointing fingers, even if it's not correct. And also, I do think these sanctions could help China, who clearly does have somewhat of a bone in this fight. Anyways, we are going to have to see because everything is just crazy. But I did just want to talk about the oligarchs because I think it's fascinating when you have a collectivist society that has basically controlled all means of production for decades on decades. And then they just start selling them off to the highest bidder in the 90s. And that does almost like create the same political structure. But instead of having the state run it, now it's private companies. And again, that's where I find the parallel between like a fascist country and what Russia's kind of become. I just saw now, as I'm recording this, there are growing protests, for example, in some of those eastern cities in Ukraine that have been taken by the Russians, and chaos is going up. Like, obviously, the Ukrainian people clearly do not want the Russians there. And I don't think that's ever going to stop until Russia's out. It just brings up so many parallels between like Afghanistan and Iraq and the Russian invasion of Afghanistan as well. And I did see on CNN about a couple minutes ago that there will be a third round of ceasefire talks tomorrow. The reason why there's a third round means that the first two fell through. So I don't have a lot of hope, but again, we never know. But we need to start finding, at the same time, an off-ramp for Putin and his cronies, because the more he thinks that there's no off-ramp, the worse it could be. So we need to just keep that in mind and understand why this economy is so strange and different and why we're using sanctions. So anyways, guys, have a great night. I'll be back this week. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, or if you're listening on Monday, happy Monday. Take care. I'm on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, iTunes, YouTube, Spotify, all that jazz. You can find me on Twitter, Alex Kapitko. Send me your thoughts. Troll me if you want. Maybe I'll respond. Who knows? But and also, if you know anyone who you think should come on the podcast, let me know. Anyways, have a good night. Take care.